The sound of my wife's wrist hitting the hardwood floor is something I will hear for the rest of my life. A dry, terrible crack that cut through the noise of 22 relatives laughing over Thanksgiving dinner, and by the time I got to the bottom of the staircase, Carol was already curled on her side, her face gray, her right hand bent at an angle a hand should never bend, and standing 3 steps above her, straightening his jacket like nothing had happened, was my son-in-law Derek, telling everyone in that smooth, unbothered voice of his that she must have simply lost her footing. I did not lose my footing that night. I have not lost it since, because I saw what actually happened on the staircase, and more importantly, I understood exactly why it happened, and understanding why is what allowed me, 3 months later, to make one phone call that took apart everything Derek Ashford had spent a decade building, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of him but a name in a court filing and a family that finally saw him clearly. To understand why a 58-year-old man would shove his mother-in-law hard enough to send her down 4 stairs, you have to go back to the day Derek first walked into our lives, because nothing about that day should have worked, and yet somehow it did. My daughter Melissa met him at a charity gala for a children's hospital, the kind of event where the appetizers cost more than most people's dinner, and Derek was there in a tailored navy suit, talking with easy confidence about diversified portfolios and impact investing to a small circle of donors, who were nodding along like he was the smartest man in the room. Melissa was drawn to that confidence. She had just come out of a difficult relationship, and here was a man who seemed to have everything figured out, who spoke about the future in certainties instead of maybes. I remember the first dinner we had with him at a steakhouse he insisted on paying for, and I remember thinking, this man talks like someone who has practiced being liked. That is not the same as being likable. It took me years to fully understand the difference, and by the time I did, he was already family. I spent 31 years as a forensic accountant, first for a regional bank, and later as an independent consultant hired by insurance companies and law firms to trace money that people did not want traced. I retired at 61, 4 years before that Thanksgiving, and I thought my working life was finished, that whatever skills I had built over 3 decades of following numbers into dark corners would simply gather dust along with my old briefcase. Carol used to joke that I could smell a bad balance sheet the way some men can smell rain coming. I did not smell anything wrong about Derek at first. Not really. Only a low hum of unease that I chalked up to being an overprotective father. He was attentive to Melissa. He remembered our birthdays. He fixed the gutter on our garage without being asked. For the first 2 years of their marriage, I told myself the hum in my gut was nothing more than an old man's habit of distrust. The hum got louder the year Melissa's grandmother passed away and left her a trust, set up specifically for our 2 grandchildren's education, a modest but meaningful sum meant to grow untouched until the kids turned 18. Derek offered, gently and reasonably, to manage it himself, since he worked in wealth management and could get better returns than a standard custodial account. Melissa thought it made sense. I did not push back the way I should have, because pushing back felt like accusing my own son-in-law of something I had no proof of, and I had spent my whole career believing that accusations without proof are just noise, the kind of noise that destroys families and helps no one. So I stayed quiet, and I started paying closer attention instead, which is a habit that never really leaves a person who spent 3 decades reading other people's financial lives for a living. What I noticed over the following 2 years was small at first, the kind of details most people would never catch. Derek's firm, Ashford Capital Advisory, had an impressive website and an office in a nice building downtown, but I could never find it registered with the State Securities Division under any search I ran using public tools. He talked about clients constantly, vaguely, always referencing deals that were about to close, funds that were performing above benchmark, opportunities that were, in his words, not for just anyone. He drove a car that upgraded every 18 months. He and Melissa bought a house in a neighborhood that seemed to stretch well past what a modest advisory practice should support, especially one that never seemed to have an actual, visible client base beyond family and a handful of friends he had somehow convinced to invest. And every single time I gently asked Melissa how his business was doing, she would say the same thing, almost like a script. Derek says it's a great year. Derek says we're ahead of projections. Derek handles all of that, Dad. You know I'm not a numbers person. The first real crack appeared 8 months before that Thanksgiving. when my other daughter Katie mentioned, almost in passing over the phone, that Derek had approached her husband about investing in what he called a private opportunity fund, promising returns of 14% annually, guaranteed. I felt something cold settle into my chest when I heard the word guaranteed, because in 31 years of forensic accounting, I had learned that legitimate investments do not guarantee anything, and men who promise guarantees are usually either lying or about to be caught lying by someone else first. I asked Katie not to invest, gave her a vague excuse about market volatility, and quietly began doing what I do. I pulled public business filings. I checked the state's registered investment advisor database, which took me all of 11 minutes to search properly, something Derek clearly assumed no one in his new family would ever bother doing. Ashford Capital Advisory was not registered as an investment advisor with the state or with the SEC. It was registered only as a generic LLC for consulting services, the kind of paper-thin structure you set up in an afternoon for $40. Not the kind of entity that legally manages other people's investment portfolios. I sat on that information for weeks, turning it over the way I used to turn over a suspicious ledger, looking for an innocent explanation, because I did not want to be right. I told myself maybe he worked under another firm's umbrella. Maybe there was a licensing technicality I was missing. I am a careful man, and careful men do not blow up their daughter's marriage on a hunch, even an educated one. But then Melissa called me one evening in October, her voice tight in a way I had never heard before, and told me that the trust fund statement Derek had shown her looked strange, the numbers not quite matching what she remembered from the year before. And when she'd asked him about it, he had gotten irritated in a way that frightened her a little, telling her she didn't understand finance and should leave it to him. That phone call is what moved me from suspicion to action, not proof yet, but intention. I decided that Thanksgiving, when the whole family would be together at our house, I would find a quiet moment to ask Derek directly, man to man, to simply show me the trust account statements. Not accuse him, just ask. I never got the calm conversation I planned. What I got instead was Derek cornering me in my own kitchen an hour before dinner, having apparently heard from Melissa that I'd been asking questions, his charm completely gone, replaced by something harder and colder that I suspect had been there underneath the whole time. He told me, quietly enough, that no one else could hear, that I needed to stop poking around in his business, that I didn't understand how modern wealth management worked, that old men like me who spent their careers pushing paper for insurance companies had no business questioning someone who actually built something. I told him just as quietly that I only wanted to see the trust statements, that it was a reasonable request for a grandfather to make. He said the statements were complicated and I wouldn't understand them anyway. I said, try me. That was when Carol walked into the kitchen, sensing the tension the way she always could, asking if everything was all right, and Derek's face did something I will never forget. A flicker of pure anger quickly smoothed back into that practiced smile before he brushed past both of us to head upstairs, saying he needed to get something from the guest room. Dinner went on with the strange, brittle politeness of a family pretending nothing had happened, and it might have stayed buried there if Carol, an hour later, hadn't gone upstairs to check on our granddaughter, who was napping in the guest room at the exact moment Derek came storming out of that same room with his phone in his hand, having clearly just gotten off a call that upset him badly, his face flushed, his jaw tight. Later, I would learn that call was from a man named Roy Castellano, one of his largest investors, demanding to know why a scheduled distribution had not appeared, a call that Derek had absolutely no good answer for. Carol, stepping out of the doorway to let him pass on the narrow staircase landing, said something small and ordinary, something like, "Careful, honey, these stairs are steep." And Derek, whether from blind fury or simple carelessness, born of a man who had stopped seeing other people as people and started seeing them only as obstacles, shoved past her hard enough that she lost her balance and fell the length of the staircase, landing on her wrist to keep her head from hitting the newel post. In the chaos of the ambulance, the emergency room, the cast, and the quiet fury I felt standing in that hospital hallway watching my wife of 36 years wince every time the nurse adjusted her arm, I made a decision that I did not announce to anyone that night. I was done being careful. I was going to find out exactly what Derek Ashford had built, and I was going to take it apart using the only tools I had ever really trusted, which were documents, patience, and the truth. The weeks that followed looked, to anyone watching from outside, like nothing at all. I did not confront Derek again. I did not tell Melissa what I suspected, because I understood something important from decades of watching families destroyed by half-finished accusations. If I came to her with suspicion instead of proof, Derek would spin it as an overprotective father who never liked him, and I would lose access to the one person who might eventually need to see clear evidence with her own eyes. So instead, I went quiet, and I went to work the way I used to when a company hired me to find out where 6 years' worth of money had actually gone. I started by pulling every public record I could find on Ashford Capital Advisory and on Derek personally, going back further than I ever had before, all the way to a business he had run in Arizona 9 years earlier, before he and Melissa ever met, something called Meridian Growth Partners. It had dissolved abruptly and buried in an old state consumer protection bulletin I found through a library database. I discovered that Meridian had been the subject of 11 complaints filed with Arizona's Securities Division, alleging Derek had solicited investments for a real estate fund that, upon closer examination, appeared to exist mostly on paper. No charges had ever been filed. The complaints had been quietly settled or had simply expired when investigators failed to build a strong enough case before Derek closed the business and relocated across the country. That told me something crucial. This was not a man who had made one bad decision under pressure. This was a pattern, a man who had built and abandoned at least one prior scheme and had simply refined his methods the second time around, learning from whatever mistakes had nearly caught him in Arizona. I sat with that discovery for 2 full days before I called an old colleague of mine, a woman named Diane Whitfield, who I had worked alongside for nearly a decade back when she was a junior investigator at the State Securities Division. And I was the outside forensic accountant law firms hired to build cases for them. Diane had since risen to become a senior enforcement officer at that same division, and she was the one person I trusted enough, and who trusted me enough in return, based on 15-year-old casework we had done together, to actually listen to what I had. I did not call her right away, though. I wanted more than a hunch and an old Arizona bulletin before I asked a friend to spend her professional credibility on my family's mess. So I spent the next 6 weeks doing what I had done for a living for 3 decades, quietly, methodically, without drama. I requested, as Melissa's father and with her reluctant permission once I finally did tell her I had real concerns, copies of every trust statement Derek had provided over the past 3 years. Reluctant, because even then, some part of her wanted to believe her husband, wanted this to be a misunderstanding rather than a betrayal. And I understood that completely, because some part of me wanted the same thing for her sake. But when I laid those statements side by side against the actual custodial records from the original bank where the trust had first been established before Derek moved it under his own management, the numbers told a story that no innocent explanation could survive. Roughly $63,000 had been withdrawn from the Children's Trust over 18 months in a series of transfers labeled as internal fund rebalancing. Transfers that led not to any legitimate investment account, but to a business checking account under Ashford Capital Advisory, an account I was able to trace, through a subpoena Diane later helped obtain, directly into payments for Derek's car lease, a country club membership, and a distribution paid out to Roy Castellano, the same investor whose angry phone call had preceded Carol's fall down our staircase. That was the second revelation that changed everything, because it meant Derek was not simply mismanaging a family trust out of arrogance or incompetence. He was running exactly what I had spent years learning to recognize in my forensic work, a classic pattern of using new money to pay off earlier investors while creating the illusion of consistent returns, the same structure that has destroyed families for 100 years under different names. Roy Castellano was not the only outside investor. Through careful, patient conversations, first with Katie's husband, who admitted Derek had pressured him twice more since that first mention, and then, once I finally sat Melissa down, with the actual documents spread across our kitchen table, through Melissa herself, who began quietly reaching out to a few of Derek's other clients under the guise of a routine check-in, we identified at least 6 other people who had invested a combined total of just over $400,000 into funds that, as far as any of us could determine, did not actually exist in any form beyond Derek's promises and a handful of professionally designed but entirely fictional performance reports. I want to be honest about the hardest part of those weeks, which was not the financial investigation itself. something I could do almost on autopilot after 31 years. But watching my daughter's face change as the evidence piled up in front of her, watching her go from disbelief to denial to a quiet, devastating grief that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with realizing the man she had built a life with, the father of her children, had been lying to her in some fashion for the entire length of their marriage. There were nights that November and December when Carol and I sat with Melissa at our kitchen table until midnight, not talking about numbers at all, just letting her cry, letting her ask the same unanswerable questions over and over. How did I not see it? What does this mean for the kids? Am I supposed to just leave him? I told her the same thing every time. The only honest thing I had to offer, that she did not have to decide anything about her marriage that night, but that she absolutely needed to protect herself and her children legally and financially before Derek had any chance to realize how much we already knew. That protection meant moving carefully and quietly, which is the only way this kind of work has ever succeeded in my experience. Melissa, at my urging and with a family law attorney Diane recommended, one experience specifically in cases involving hidden or dissipated marital assets, began the process of separating her own finances from Derek's without tipping him off that anything was wrong, opening an individual account, redirecting her own modest salary away from their joint accounts under the reasonable cover story of wanting to save independently for the kids' summer camp. Meanwhile, I finished compiling what amounted to a complete forensic case file, bank records, the falsified trust statements laid against the real custodial history, the pattern of investor payments that matched almost textbook characteristics of a Ponzi structure, and the old Arizona complaints that showed this was not a first offense, but a refined second act. It took 11 weeks in total, working most days for several hours, the kind of focused, unglamorous labor that never makes for exciting television, but is the only thing that actually builds a case strong enough to survive a defense attorney's scrutiny. When I finally called Diane, I did not lead with accusations or emotion. I led with documents, because that is what she and every good investigator actually needs. And I laid out the entire timeline for her over coffee at a diner near her office, watching her expression shift from professional politeness into the focused stillness I remembered from our old casework together, the look she got when she recognized she was looking at something real. She told me that afternoon that the division had actually received 2 prior informal complaints about Ashford Capital Advisory over the past year, complaints that had been logged but not yet prioritized due to limited staffing and the difficulty of building a case from an outside complainant's word alone. What I had just handed her, she said, was the difference between a complaint that sits in a drawer and a case that gets opened same week. That was the phone call. Not dramatic, not shouted, not delivered in anger, just an old colleague sliding a thick folder across a diner table and saying, "I think you need to look at this, and I think you need to look at it soon, because there are at least 7 families who don't yet know what's about to happen to their money, and one little girl who already fell down a staircase because a man got a phone call he couldn't answer honestly." What followed over the next 4 months unfolded with the particular, grinding thoroughness of a real investigation rather than a Hollywood takedown. The State Securities Division opened a formal inquiry, subpoenaed Ashford Capital's accounts, and quickly corroborated everything in the file I had assembled, along with additional violations I hadn't even uncovered, including 2 other trust accounts belonging to elderly clients that Derek had also quietly drained under similar rebalancing language. Roy Castellano, once investigators contacted him directly, turned out to be more than willing to cooperate fully once he understood he was not the only victim, providing his own detailed records of the 14% guaranteed returns Derek had promised him in writing, a promise that on its own constituted a serious securities violation, given that Ashford Capital had never been properly registered to offer such products in the first place. Melissa, working with her attorney, filed for divorce the same week the state's asset freeze order went into effect, a timing her attorney had carefully coordinated to ensure that whatever remained of the marital assets, including what could still be recovered of the children's trust, would be protected under the court's jurisdiction before Derek could move or hide anything further. Derek did try to fight it, of course, because men like him rarely go quietly, and there was a period of about 6 weeks where he showed up at Melissa's workplace uninvited, called her repeatedly insisting the whole thing was a misunderstanding that could still be fixed, and even tried, in one particularly ugly phone call I happened to be present for, to convince her that I, her own father, had fabricated evidence out of jealousy and resentment toward him. Melissa, to her enormous credit, and I say this as a father who could not have been prouder of her in that moment, simply told him that she had seen the bank records herself, in her own name, tracing her own children's college money into his country club dues, and that no amount of talking was going to undo what the numbers already showed. That was the moment I understood she had truly moved from denial into clarity. And it was, in its own quiet way, more satisfying to witness than anything that happened in a courtroom afterward. The legal resolution, when it finally came the following autumn, was almost anticlimactic compared to the emotional weight of everything that led up to it, which I have come to believe is usually how real justice actually looks, quiet and procedural rather than cinematic. Derek pleaded guilty to securities fraud charges rather than risk trial, given the overwhelming documentary evidence against him, and was sentenced to 4 years, with restitution ordered to his victims, including full repayment to the Children's Trust, a repayment that will take him most of the rest of his working life to complete, given the size of the judgment relative to what he actually has left. His investment advisory registration, such as it barely was permanently revoked, and the state issued a public consumer alert bearing his name and photograph, meaning that whatever charm he still possessed would no longer open doors the way it once had, not in that state or in any other, given how thoroughly these records now follow a person. He lost the house, he lost the car, most painfully for a man who had built his entire identity around appearing successful. He lost the ability to ever again convince a room full of strangers that he was the smartest person in it. Because now, before anyone signs anything with Derek Ashford, all they have to do is search his name. Carol's wrist healed slowly, the way bones do at our age, and she still gets a dull ache in it when the weather turns cold, a small, permanent reminder of that. Thanksgiving that I know she carries the way I carry the memory of that sound on the staircase. But what healed alongside her wrist was something more important, which was Melissa's confidence in her own judgment, badly shaken by discovering how completely she had been deceived, rebuilt slowly through the process of taking her life back one deliberate decision at a time, choosing her own bank, her own attorney, her own path forward for herself and her children. The grandchildren, too young to understand most of what happened, know only that their mother seems steadier now, that visits to our house are calmer, that the tension that used to fill certain rooms when their father walked in has simply evaporated. I think often about how close I came to staying silent that Thanksgiving, to telling myself once again that pushing back on family felt too uncomfortable, too accusatory, too likely to cause exactly the kind of rupture it eventually caused anyway. What I learned, watching my wife fall down those stairs and watching my daughter slowly climb back out of a marriage built on lies, is that protecting the people you love sometimes requires exactly the kind of careful, patient, unglamorous work I spent 31 years doing for strangers, and that the quietest phone call, made not in anger but in preparation, can accomplish more than any confrontation ever could. Derek thought a family full of ordinary, aging people would never think to check his numbers. He was wrong about that. The same way he was wrong about a great many things, and in the end it was not violence or shouting or revenge in any dramatic sense that brought his entire carefully constructed life down around him, but simply the truth, laid out plainly enough, and handed to exactly the right person, at exactly the right time.